Hi, welcome to Playing with Fire podcast. I'm your host, Brian Spatulski, ex-firefighter, current fire investigator. And today I have a very special guest with me. I'm going to call you Colonel Dean Winslow, but you are a doctor, so I'm torn between the two. But there's not really a disciplinary effect if I call you doctor. So I'm going to stick with Colonel because you can probably still do some military justice on me if I don't address you properly. So Dr. Winslow and I have an interesting recent past. He was a doctor while I was in the hospital, and he helped me with a spinal tap. He actually did my spinal tap. And during that procedure, we strung up a really nice conversation about his active duty tours, where he comes from, how often or how much he was deployed. And we also started talking about some of the PTSD issues. Sir, it is an honor to have you here. Thank you for such short notice, considering I got out of the hospital, Saturday? So this is extremely short notice. If you don't mind, give me a little bit of your background. I've got your bio. We're going to include the bio with your permission on the podcast link, but give us a little bit of story of who you are.
First of all, Brian, I want to thank you and Darlene for this amazing podcast series that you're doing. And also thank you both for your service. And, you both in the military as well as a firefighter and then now fire investigator, and Darlene's work as a law enforcement officer. Both of you really are, in my mind, it's incredibly admirable what
Thank
you've
you.
done in your lives and your career. Just a little bit of background. I'm almost 73 years old now, born in 1953. And again, went to Penn State as an undergraduate and then to Jefferson, Philadelphia for medical school. I've got a wife and four children now, three, or actually they're all grown now. I miss having little kids around. Again, my specialty training is in internal medicine and then subspecialty training in infectious diseases. I'm still working full time at Stanford University, and I take care of both adults and children. Very lucky. I always wanted to be a doctor from the time I was very small. So to me, it's a dream come true. And also, I've been a pilot since I was 13 years old. So being a flight surgeon in the U.S. Air Force and the Air National Guard, as I was for 35 years, that was an amazing dream come true. Basically combining being an aerospace medicine doctor with still being able to
Wow.
fly as a crew member in military aircraft was just absolutely amazing, and again, very grateful for those years.
So what happened to your application to NASA? Because really, that's the only thing you really haven't done yet, right? I mean, are you going there? No, I'm guessing not. No NASA stuff in your future. Okay. When we were talking in my hospital room where you did the spinal tap, which was extremely weird, and I will say that to you once again, and I'm still sore, just putting that out there.
Uh,
We talked about some of your combat deployments, what you were while you were over in Iraq. Tell me a little bit about when you arrived in theater in Iraq and what was your primary job? What did you do there?
well, first of all, I did deploy three times to Eastern Turkey and Northern Iraq between the two
Wow.
Gulf Wars. We had what was called Operation Provide Comfort and Operation Northern Watch. And in fact, two of those three deployments, I actually went in on the ground, asked by U.S. Army Special Forces to make visits to these Kurdish villages. And that made just a huge impression on me. And I remember this one village that I went to, and again, the Mukhtar, which is like the elder in the village, he said to all of us, if you had not come here and protected us, none of these beautiful children that you see would be alive today. So that was one reason, just talking a little bit, maybe more than I should. But, I actually was very much in favor of our eventual invasion of Iraq in 2003 to basically remove Saddam Hussein, who single-handedly, his regime killed thousands and thousands of both Kurds in the north and Shia in the south. In fact, he even used poison gas to kill many of the people in a fairly large village called Halabja after the first Gulf War. So again, war is horrible, but to me, it was something that we really needed to do. So I deployed, well, after 9/11, the first deployment I did was as the flight surgeon responsible for combat rescue operations, basically from the AOR from Tikrit all the way, including all of northern
Wow.
Iraq. And actually, it was pretty quiet. We were thankfully did not lose any combat aircraft during our invasion, at least up north in 2003. And then we went home late April of that year. And then, of course, the insurgency kicked off. And so I went back with my actual unit, which is the Delaware Air National Guard C-130 unit, in August of that year and was there, I think, until after Thanksgiving. And then, of course, I went to Afghanistan for a 4-month deployment in '04, and then worked as an ER doctor and the deputy commander, basically, of our U.S. Air Force Combat Hospital in Baghdad in 2006, and then returned as the commander of the 447th EMIDS in Baghdad in 2008. And then my last deployment was in 2011, again back to Afghanistan at Bagram Airfield.
Okay, and I probably should have started with you are a retired colonel with the U.S. Air Force. So we would go to the Air Force base to go out to eat when we were at the Army base, Fort Lewis, Washington. You had McCord up there, joint base now, but it used to be a separate post or bases. When you guys deploy to Iraq, what was your primary role the first time you deployed after 9/11?
Yeah, so again, combat rescue, basically, you use two different aircraft. One is a special operations air refueling tanker. Basically, it's a modified C-130 called an MC-130. And then the primary helicopters that we use are called Pavehawks. And again, they have the ability to be refueled in flight. And so, the main people, of course, that are in combat rescue unit are, of course, the air crew, but also these amazing, basically special operations airmen that we call PJs, or pararescue jumpers. And so again, these are just amazingly talented, bright people. They're all basically trained as paramedics. And again, they're smart, brave, athletic. And it was a real honor to fly with them and the other crew that we had.
Ironically, I tried out for the pararescue team there at Moffett Field. A buddy of mine, Orlando, he's probably going to be listening to this, got the crazy idea, hey, let's go ahead and try out. We had already gotten out of the military, so we were both civilians. He thought that would be kind of an interesting job, which it was amazing now that I know what those guys do. I was just before getting into the career in the fire service, and I thought I'll go ahead and try it. So they had an open agility over there at Moffett Field. I never thought I was so close to death as I was after that physical agility. First, we did the run, then we did the push-ups, sit-ups, chin-ups, and then they took us over to the pool, and they killed us in that pool. I think it was 3,200 meters. You didn't have a time frame on it, but when you were done doing the swim, you had to start doing the underwater side to side 10 times. You'd get out, do a push-up, go to the other side, get out, do a push-up, but you had to hold your breath underwater between. And then when you got past 5, they started to put one of the frogmen in between, and he would impede you a little bit. If you came up and took a breath, you got out and you started all over again. This is no kidding. Orlando and I sat in the parking lot of the McDonald's right outside of the base, and we seriously considered calling a tow truck to drive us all the way back to Modesto because we were done. I met the minimum, so they had called me up and said, do you want to go? And I said, I'm sorry, no. You guys would kill me. I have the utmost respect for those guys just because they pass that agility. So off of that now, it's funny to be able to talk about that and be able to laugh. And I tell my son about it all the time. My youngest, he was interested for a little while going into the military before he decided on the fire service. So now we joke about the pararescue guys out there. And he still, I think, has a little bit of a thought of it that he's 20, so he's still young enough and be willing to do it, but it's way beyond me.
Yeah. Amazing story. And I didn't know that when we met the other day. I actually, because I flew over water missions with them here in California with the 129th Rescue Wing, I actually had to do U.S. Navy helicopter underwater egress training. And you've probably seen that in various movies. They show it actually is even more painful than it is in the movie. So in the Air Force, we would consider something like that. We call it practice bleeding, so.
So, sir, your first deployment, were you a helicopter pilot or you were the combat medic?
I was actually the flight surgeon. So, again, I would go out on some missions, but not all. My main job, though, as flight surgeon, of course, was to take care of the air crew. And again, we were initially operating out of Incirlik Air Base. And then every day I got on the C-130 and we flew forward to Diyarbakir, which is in the very far eastern part of Turkey. And there we were on 15-minute alert, in case any aircraft were lost over the northern part of the AOR.
Okay. Any interesting stories you can throw our way without revealing anything sensitive?
Absolutely. Just again, it was a great group of people to deploy with. The mission was wonderful. And as I said, we were very fortunate that we did not lose any aircraft up in the northern AOR during the invasion in '03. Again, we all felt pretty good about everything, when we went home at the end of April of that year.
Okay. When was the first time you actually came into a kind of a life experience?
When I went back to Iraq, most of the missions we flew actually to various airfields and cities, in Iraq. And at that time, again, the insurgency had really just started to take off. So it was very common for us to see small arms fire,
Hmm.
particularly at night. It's more visible when you're on night vision goggles. And I remember one time we were taking off to the southeast out of Baghdad International. And this would have been probably in August or September of '03. And again, I was basically serving as a tactical scanner in the left aft paratroop door of the C-130 and saw basically a flash and a corkscrew coming up. And it was almost certainly an SA-7, which
Wow.
is a Soviet-built heat-seeking missile. Fortunately, the flares actually detected it and spat out and then decoyed the missile, and it exploded harmlessly behind our aircraft. And then that similar thing happened again during my last deployment in Afghanistan in 2011, and we were taking off out of Sharana airfield in the far eastern part of Afghanistan, and we were taking off to the west when probably climbing through about 1,000 feet when, similar thing, the NVGs lit up, a flash and a corkscrew. So.
That's got to be harrowing. Just seeing that coming at you or knowing there are hostiles down there that want you out of the sky and they're doing whatever they can to get to you has got to be a little bit scary all by itself.
It almost has a surreal aspect to it. So I'm not some brave guy or anything like that, but I don't really remember being that scared because again, you're doing your
Right.
job and everything happens so fast. And so I think, some of the things that maybe ruminate about too much now are some of the things that I witnessed as a doctor, both working in the emergency room, at our combat hospital in Baghdad in '06 and '08. And then, of course, sadly, getting called over to the morgue, usually about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, to unzip body bags of soldiers and
Oh,
Marines killed earlier that day. And I can't get some of those images out of my mind. And, it's one of the reasons that war is just
right.
so horrible. And I think the average American just has no idea about just how terrible it is. So honestly, I think those memories are more powerful or more, in a way, frightening or upsetting than any of the combat missions that I flew on as a flight surgeon.
Right. And that's a perfect segue into where I kind of wanted to go with this conversation is some of the PTSD things, because as first responders, my wife and I, we deal with, what our experiences are. And when we started this podcast, it wasn't all going to be about PTSD. It was going to be
Mhm.
everything fire. I mean, we're going to be looking at old fires, the 1906 earthquake fire. And if you've gone on to the podcast, you'll see we've got a whole bunch of different kinds of things going on. But we kind of morphed
Mhm.
into this PTSD discussion because, one, we're directly connected to it. Having that ability to communicate with the ones that I know that have the issues and making a difference with them has been huge with us. I've had so many people reach out to me about Darlene's podcast where she's spoke of her adoption and the things that she went through. They said how brave she is and what she's done. And that makes a huge impact on us because we are making a difference with somebody. And that's all that we really wanted to do, was to kind of have some fun. But when we got to the PTSD, to make a difference with those. So, as you were kind of describing some of your duties, I can understand the nightmares that you have, or at least the visions that are challenging for you. You watch the podcast with Dr. Andreski.
I did, yes.
You kind of understand how the brain works, but what are your triggers? Do you know?
First of all, I was just so impressed with just the insights that she shared. Again, I'm not a psychiatrist. Obviously, PTSD and of course aspects of psychiatry are things that as an internist that we're expected to know about. But again, I think some of her insights in terms of really just how the brain works and also explaining like why these memories, if anything, become more powerful, as the years go by. So I thought that was really helpful. I think with me, it's sometimes the things that kind of trigger some of these bad memories are random. I think this happened maybe after you and I met, perhaps over the weekend, but the martial
Hmm.
artist Chuck
Yeah.
Norris passed away a few days ago. Of course, he's beloved by most of us in the military. And one of the things that I remember about every 2 or 3 weeks, the Army Combat Support Hospital in the Green Zone on the east side of Baghdad, I'd get a call from the commander or from one of the doctors or requesting me to hop on a Black Hawk helicopter to fly from the west side of Baghdad, where our unit was, over to the east side to see a patient in consultation that had an interesting problem, or give a lecture. I gave several lectures over at the Army Cache. And in the lobby of this old Iraqi hospital called Ibn Sina Hospital, both in '06 and '08, there was this bulletin board set up, and it had probably 500 post-it notes with Chuck Norris
Oh my
sayings. You
gosh.
probably heard many of these. They're just hilarious. I remember one of them that I loved was that Chuck Norris has a nightlight in his bedroom, not because he's afraid of the dark, but because the dark is afraid of Chuck Norris. But one of the things that honestly, that as I was, I had some of these digital files, so I was going to just post them on Facebook to make people laugh. But one of the post-it notes that I had a picture of, it said Chuck Norris was born with two umbilical cords, one red and one blue. EOD cut the
Oh,
wrong one. And I remember at the time thinking that was funny. But then 2 or 3 weeks later, I was actually over at the Glass House, which is what we called the 447th Expeditionary Airlift Group headquarters, which was only about 100 yards from my EMEDs. And I was walking back. It was probably 4 o'clock in the afternoon, still hot, more than 100 degrees, like it is in the summer in Baghdad. And, I heard a loud explosion coming from the EOD area, which was the north side of our base. I didn't think too much of it, but usually, though, we had a giant voice that would actually, 5 minutes prior to a controlled detonation, the giant voice would come off and it would say, "Alert, alert, there will be a controlled detonation in 5 minutes." Then they would make another announcement, let's say a minute prior to the controlled detonation. And then you'd hear the explosion, but you weren't alarmed because you'd been warned and you weren't worried that you were under attack or anything. And it was a little unusual that I heard the explosion, but I'd not heard the giant voice announce it. But again, that occasionally happened. They would sometimes forget, to make an announcement on giant voice, and that you'd hear the explosion. Then afterward, that they would say that was a controlled detonation. Well, anyway, in this case, I was busy and I went back to the EMEDs. And an hour later, the phone rings. My enlisted medic answers it, and he says, "Colonel, it's the morgue. They want you to go over there and basically pronounce death." And again, it turned out that explosion was an accidental explosion. An EOD guy
mm,
literally cut the wrong cord and was blown up. But again, when I went over to the morgue, to unzip his body bag and to pronounce him, his buddy, who was also an EOD airman, was there, a young guy, and he had tears streaming down his face. And I literally put my arm around him like a father would. He's probably as young as my children, and I told him that you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay and everything. And he just kept crying. And he said to me, "Colonel, I'll never forget this, but when the bomb went off," and he was only like 30 yards away, he said he turned into a
mhm.
pink mist. And so it was like so weird. Like your last weekend, I see just randomly this post-it note photograph that I took back in 2008, and it brought back the memories of pronouncing this airman's death, and his buddy describing the scene. His buddy turned into a pink mist. And so that really honestly took the wind out of my sails for 3 or 4 days.
I can only say I'm so sorry for not only his buddy, but for the EOD tech that lost his life there and his family. Thank God he didn't feel anything, if there's any blessing to it. But
Well,
I can understand that being something that would trigger. And obviously, the note brought that memory right back to you. It was one of the things you said you woke up out of a sleep. Were you sweating, getting headaches? Were you just finding yourself pulling back and not talking?
Yeah, I think probably more the latter. My wife is actually out of town right now. She's in South Africa with her research and everything. So I think, being by myself, I didn't really have anybody to talk to except for our sociopathic cat. But
Aren't they all that way?
anyway, they are. Yeah, they all are.
Right.
No, so it took the wind out of my sails. And honestly, I probably drank a few more beers than I normally do and that sort of thing. And I realized those are not adaptive ways of dealing with stress. But again, even though I'm a doctor, I'm still a
Right.
human. And watching that podcast that you did with Dr. Andreski the other day was actually really, really helpful and really
Good.
insightful.
Well, I'll say that if you ever get somewhere like that again and you do need to call, you have my cell number. My wife and I will always pick up the phone for you, even if we're sleeping. So,
Well, that's really good to know. And again, I certainly would never abuse that privilege or anything, but I think it's just ironic in a very positive way that I was this doctor called in to do a procedure on you at
right.
Stanford last week, and you're offering basically to be my doctor. But it's really helpful to be actually have
Yes.
another veteran that you can talk to. And again, you're not only a military veteran, but you and your wife are both first responder veterans. And so, this is not something that is foreign to that field at all. I love all my colleagues and everything, but honestly, so few of them have the same perspective that, for example, you and I and Darlene have coming from our
Right.
backgrounds in the military and in law enforcement.
I would encourage you also to check out a couple of the other podcasts, especially the ones with Chuck Butler, my captain, where we talk about a very traumatic incident that we went through and some of the things that we have found just since we've gotten back together, because that was over 20 years ago. But we started to talk about doing this a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. And right after we did the very first one, he looked at me with tears in his eyes and was, this helped because I didn't know what you would think, knowing that I made the decision for us to go out to this incident that triggered all of this. So there's so many things that will help. And this is to everybody out there with PTSD, is you're not alone. To think that you're
Mhm.
alone or that there is no way out of this and you're thinking of the last act that you do is so not realistic. I mean, guys like you and me would be more than willing to drop whatever we're doing if it meant talking to somebody and saving a life or just comforting a soul. That would make the difference. And again, that's what we want to do. You're a doctor, you want to make a difference. So
Yeah.
understanding the mind, and that's what Dr. Andreski was kind of helping me with because I was emotional during mine. I didn't realize it was still affecting me until I said it to her exactly where
Mm,
my trigger or where my guilt was. And that was not reaching out to Antoine, my engineer, when I could have,
mm.
and maybe I could have made a difference. And that's my cross that I kind of carry. I don't want that to be another one with anybody else. And I just saw a stat yesterday that there's 77 self-inflicted gunshot deaths every day in this country.
Yeah.
And the veterans, I would guess, are probably more than three quarters of that.
Yeah, last number I heard, maybe it might have this wrong, was like 27 veterans a day kill themselves. And by far, like probably more than 90% choose a
Right.
firearm to do it, which is almost 100% lethal. And there's no going back. It's not taking an
Right.
overdose of pills where you can have your stomach pumped, but you put a 9 millimeter or a 40 cal pistol to your head and pull the trigger. You're not going to survive that.
Right. And that's one of the things that I'm sure we can link in again at the end of this podcast is the Veterans Administration has helplines, will help
Hmm.
veterans and not just for the veteran, but also for the first responders because first responders cover everybody from police, fire, all the way through dispatchers. There are so many people that are touched by traumatic incidents that I think if you talk to
Hmm.
your neighbor, they would probably have something that scarred them somewhere down in their life. Now, the first responder side of it, we see it almost every day, or it's almost a common, I don't want to say common
Hmm.
event, but it seems to be more regular with us. And as you being a doctor in a hospital, I'm sure you come across a lot of that, those difficult family talks and things like that. So God bless you for what you're doing and saving lives and touching lives. I mean, you're here with Darlene and I talking because you touched us in that room. You literally drained me, and I mean that in a funny way. Let's kind of transition out of the sad part of this and let's talk about where you are now. You've got something coming up in the next week, a couple of days, actually, if I recall. Why don't you give a little plug on that if you can, or do you not want to?
Yeah, so actually, myself and two other faculty have been running this leadership in medicine class. And, we call it basically discovering your moral identity. So we have interviews. And again, we have the class, one term, quarter each year. And we've had some amazing guests that are interviewed by Paul Costello, who's just this amazing interviewer. He's the former chief of public affairs for the medical school at Stanford. And so some of the guests that we've had include General Jim Mattis, who, of course, was Secretary of Defense during the first Trump administration, one of the more distinguished officers that any of us ever served with. And I think no matter what your branch of service, Air Force, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, that all of us that served in Iraq and Afghanistan look up to General Mattis as probably the real iconic warrior of our generation. So he's there every year. Gretchen Carlson, who is very famous for basically being the person many people attribute to starting the Me Too movement, former Fox News broadcaster who sued Roger Ailes. And she's also, by the way, a Stanford graduate. And we've had a number of other really amazing people come to the class. And there's also, by the way, a very powerful video that was recorded just before he died. This is with Representative John Lewis, who was a real icon in the early civil rights movement and later was a U.S. congressman. And again, some of the things that he said in that interview with Paul Costello are just so incredibly powerful, and how he was actually even able to forgive the Ku Klux Klansmen that beat him in Rock Hill, South Carolina, back in the early 1960s. And again, just a very powerful story to tell. We've had other leaders from business. We've had Steve Kerr was at our class last year, I believe. Tony Fauci,
wow.
we interviewed last year. And this year, actually, one of our folks that we're having is the Bishop of Washington, D.C., Marion Buddy, the Episcopal Bishop, who has spoken out more than maybe most religious people have about some of the things going on, in our country and how that relates to Christianity. And again, invited you and your wife to come and sit in on our class next week.
Well, thank you for that invitation. I do appreciate it. And you and I have already kind of talked about that. Is there anything you would like to add or any questions that you have before we shut this down?
I think the main thing that I wanted to just thank you for was the fact that you and Darlene have created this podcast, and you're going to be able to reach so many people and help so many people. As I said, just watching that one video that I did a few days ago with Dr. Andreevsky was just
That's
incredibly helpful. And also hearing your very kind offer to be one of the people that I can reach out to when I'm feeling really down about things is so helpful.
Absolutely. And that is a truthful offer. You already have my phone number, so can't pull it back. So now you got it. And I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day, for all of your accomplishments, and for all the lives that you have saved and touched. Thank you. As a veteran to a veteran, thank you. And hopefully we can reach some other people, maybe indirectly, that this might make a little difference for. And as we kind of do more of these podcasts, maybe there's more that we can do. I would enjoy having you back on and maybe talking about some more issues or see how things are going in 6 months or so, see how you're doing. Hopefully the sleepless nights or the anxiety will lighten up, and when your wife gets back, it'll all be better.
Well, Brian, thank you again so much. It really is an honor to be on your show.
Thank you, sir. For everybody out there watching, we hope you enjoyed this one. We had a great time putting it together. I hope that it helps those that need help, and those of you that are just watching, I hope it was entertaining for you. Thank you, sir, for being here.
Thank you, Brian.